Okay, wonderful. So, hi everyone. Good morning. My name is Nikki Schultek, and I'm the founder of Intracell Research Group. And what I'm hosting today is a series called Brave Scientists, where I'll be having discussions with various people working in the scientific field doing disruptive work that helps us to innovate and better understand some of our most devastating diseases. And today, the topic is to discuss how COVID, our current pandemic, can possibly, inform research strategies and give us pathways forward to better understand the role of infectious pathogens in diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And it is my absolute pleasure to have with me today Dr. Brian Balin. Dr. Balin is a colleague of mine and a friend. He's the director for the Center of Chronic Disorders of Aging at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Brian is also an internationally recognized Alzheimer's disease expert and has published numerous papers and research studies along the lines of neuropathology and disease pathology, as well as the pathogen hypothesis. So welcome, Brian. It's so great to see you today and to have you here and to go through this discussion together.
Thank you, Nikki. It's my pleasure to be here too.
Wonderful. So, Brian, it's really kind of timely right now that about a month ago, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference took place, virtually, of course. And I thought I would just kick off by asking you what you thought was one of the most interesting things that emerged from that conference from a research perspective.
Yeah, so I followed the conference at a distance, obviously, since it's all virtual.
Sure.
But I found that one of the more interesting studies that came out was dealing with vaccinations, especially for influenza and pneumonia, and how individuals that were vaccinated multiple times had a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And that sort of helps us to try to understand how an infectious agent potentially could also be involved with this disease process, or infectious agents. The study suggests that vaccination either is doing a couple of different things, and they may be multiple things at the same time. One is diminishing inflammation in an individual over periods of time so that you don't get reactivation events of different chronic organisms that have been found in Alzheimer's disease brains, such as the herpes simplex virus 1, our chlamydia pneumoniae organism, at times Borrelia for Lyme disease, and other organisms as well, other herpes viruses. So when we evaluate what those vaccinations are doing, we think potentially another aspect of that is that you're getting some level of crossover immunity, which could be very interesting. So that a vaccination against certain organisms might have a level of response to generate a memory response, an immune memory response that could potentially help us keep other organisms in check. And maybe that's a key to this process of vaccination, limiting then individuals going on to develop Alzheimer's disease.
That's really interesting, and it seems like it's a potential puzzle piece, right, to sort of fill in some of the mystery of Alzheimer's disease. And then sort of similarly, what we're noticing with SARS-CoV-2, the current pandemic, COVID, that various systems of the body are being impacted by the virus acutely. And one of the systems, of course, is, that seems to be impacted is the brain. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit to some of the publications implicating potentially long-term cognitive effects in patients with COVID.
Yeah, so this is a real interesting effect from this virus and a sequelae from this type of infection. And so in the evaluation of the work that's coming out in the analysis of individuals with this infection, it's been demonstrated that there is cognitive change in a number of, and these numbers are have been reported as high as 45% of individuals infected developing some type of cognitive change and cognitive deficit. Also, the sense of smell. The sense of smell seems to be diminished in many of these individuals.
Mhm.
That sort of gives us a clue as to where this infection is taking place, and
Mhm.
also that there may be um, a process occurring here that would lead to the organism actually getting into the brain proper. So what's been found is this, is that in the upper respiratory tract, in our noses, the receptors, the what we call the ACE2 receptors for
Mhm.
this organism, the spike protein of the organism binds to those receptors.
Mhm.
They're expressed at hundreds of times higher than in the lower respiratory tract. So the thought here is that with the expression of those receptors, you're getting now an increased viral load into the nasal passages. What we have in the nasal passages are obviously our receptors for our sense of smell, the olfactory neuroepithelial cells. What's real interesting here is that a number of studies have shown it's not the sensory cells or the cells that actually are now communicating into the brain that are being directly infected. I think over time they could be, but not directly. It's the supporting cells, your sustentacular cells, your stem cells, your basal cells, your perivascular cells surrounding this tissue.
Wow.
But others feel that potentially the organism, after it infects those particular cells, is actually also infecting the olfactory neuroepithelial cells, allowing for the organism to go into the brain. What that would do is really interesting. What it would do is actually bypass the blood-brain barrier, which is really the barrier that is protecting our brains for the most part. Now, what's
Sure.
also interesting is this infection goes systemic. It will infect the endothelial cells in our bodies, lining the blood vessels. So it will travel around the body as well. So there's also evidence that you have another pathway into the brain, and that would be through the blood-brain barrier as well. So now you have two possible hits of an organism getting into the central nervous system, creating now inflammation and a response in the brain of the glial cells and nerve cells so that they now dysfunction. And as you get this dysfunction, you're starting to see now the sequelae from it, the fogginess, the cognitive change or cognitive slowness, headaches, the vascular input also is leading to an increased risk for developing blood clots because
Sure.
what you're generating here is an arterial system, venous system change in cytokines that are being now expressed, but also damage directly to the endothelial cells, the cells lining these vessels that are now leading to now increased potential for clotting. When you get that, you're also going to have the risk for stroking because of clots forming going into the brain.
Sure.
This is also something that's been seen in younger individuals in particular, which is a really frightening outcome.
Absolutely.
The other process here is that we don't know how chronic these organisms or this particular organism actually could become in nervous tissue. We just don't have that information yet. We
Right.
also have supporting evidence that individuals looking at brain organoids, which are now these cells in three-dimensional cultures, where you can infect them with this virus and they infect, suggesting then that the virus does infect nerve cells as well as glial cells. And of course, the endothelial cells and perivascular cells throughout the body.
And the work that you have done over the past few decades with chlamydia pneumoniae, one can't help but notice some of the things that you're stating are similarities between the various pathogens, including chronic pathogens like chlamydia or even the herpes viruses, for example, which can, as you pointed out, sort of exploit this pathway up through the nose, right, and possibly enter the brain through various routes. So, can you talk a little bit about how the situation with COVID is, at all in relation to the work that you've already done over the last few decades?
Yes, so the COVID response that we're seeing here in this infection in the nervous system is more of an acute issue with this particular virus. So these things are happening fairly rapidly. And it could be that the virus is at a high dose. Now we're being exposed to this high dose of organism that now is infecting more readily in the nasal passages, so the olfactory system, but also in the blood as well. So that it's now your dose is so high that you're now running the risk because of the increased dose of this getting into the brain. With our studies with the chlamydia pneumoniae issue, years ago we found that this organism, it's an intracellular bacterium, actually now it's a respiratory intracellular bacterium, could actually get into the brain through our olfactory system and also through the bloodstream. And we have this two-hit process that we've identified also with this organism. So when we found this, we thought, okay, well, this is how an organism, an infectious agent, could actually now get into the nervous system, set up a chronic, persistent infection that could over time lead to change in the nervous system. The olfactory issue here is key, we believe. And it's because olfaction, the receptors for olfaction go into what's called the olfactory bulb of the brain. Mm-hmm. And from the olfactory bulbs of the brain, you have direct input into the hippocampal region, actually the entorhinal cortex region, which then goes to the hippocampus, but also to the amygdala. Those two areas are key areas that are damaged in many, many neurodegenerative diseases, mm-hmm. and in Alzheimer's in particular, especially the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus in Alzheimer's disease. So literally, you could bypass the blood-brain barrier with an infectious agent, leading to now insult in the regions that are first affected in Alzheimer's disease. So this is sort of connecting the dots. Other organisms can do this as well. The herpes simplex virus 1 and some of the other herpes viruses like HHV6, potentially HHV7 as well. Cytomegalovirus potentially as well could do this. So it's a lot of the herpes organisms. There are some oral organisms, potentially the Porphyromonas gingivalis organism that is involved with periodontitis, could mm-hmm. also be involved this way and have egress through the olfactory passage. And now with our studies, we've also found that the chlamydia organism can also now be picked up in the lungs by monocytes and circulating around the bloodstream in monocytes. Mm-hmm. And that's how the organism could also get into the brain. So now we have, in what we've studied for over 20 years now, sure. a process that we're also seeing happening with this COVID, with the COVID story, with CoV-2. Mm-hmm. And we're thinking, look at this similarity. The scary part of this is that with CoV-2, if this resides in the nervous system and can set up a chronic or persistent state, potentially people infected this way could have a very negative outcome. Now, we don't know this at this point in time because it's still the early days of evaluation and analysis. We're hoping that's not the case.
Right.
But what we're seeing with our chronic infections in Alzheimer's disease is that we believe they're related to the change happening and could actually potentiate or be the triggering mechanisms sure. for developing the neurodegenerative process and starting the pathophysiology that we see in the disease process.
And really, this is sort of a contrast, right? Because this current pandemic and this novel pathogen is behaving like this, but it's quick, it's happening fast. Whereas, that there's a bit of a difference, right? And some of the chronic pathogens seem to behave in this manner, but over a longer period of time.
Yes, it's very true. And so this is like a model. If we look at it this way, what we're finding is this acute model for infectivity of the nervous system leading to changes that are similar to the changes we're seeing with these chronic organisms over periods of time. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that's going on here is that we think that it's not only these two pathways, potentially with the CoV-2 issue, potentially CoV-2 and maybe other organisms, even with Alzheimer's disease, could be coming in from what we call the microbiota that's developing in our other microbiota system. We'll put it this way, that you could also have insult of the vagal nerve and vagal uptake of organisms that can also get into the brain. Now, the vagus is a key cranial nerve
Mm-hmm.
that innervates gastrointestinal tract, the heart, etc. And there are receptors in other parts of the body where these nerves will now entertain or come into contact with potentially other organisms.
Wow.
If that nerve gets infected, you can have now transference of organism back into the brain in the brainstem region of the body.
Hmm.
Okay, so what does that mean in relationship to COVID-2 and COVID-19? There have been a few studies showing that in some people, um, they actually, when you do a CT scan of the lungs,
Mm-hmm.
where you're expecting now this massive damage, there's a small percentage of people that don't have massive damage in their lungs, but they have respiratory insufficiency. And the question becomes why? Now, if you have vagal insult into the brainstem, because that vagal nucleus in the brainstem also is involved with respiration,
Sure.
we may be affecting respiration through the central nervous system that
Wow.
is now reflective of these people struggling to breathe. In other words, it's now the nervous system control of breathing and the respiratory centers that are being affected.
So it's your autonomic functions, right? All the
Correct. So
autonomic
these
functions.
autonomic functions now are really put into play here. And so some people may be suffering that as well, which tells us then that nervous system insult is occurring and
Sure.
potentially in many different ways.
Fascinating. And then that begs the question of, other infectious agents like Borrelia burgdorferi, Lyme disease. One of the frequent, presentations is shortness of breath or dyspnea. But frequently the, examination of the lung, or CT scan is completely unremarkable. So then you wonder if some of these intracellular pathogenic organisms are doing just what COVID is doing, with that nerve potentially too.
Yes. And so our fear here is that with what we've discovered and what we continue to study to really try to understand how infection can actually cause neurodegenerative processes like Alzheimer's disease and maybe many others. How will COVID-2 also inform us with there are a lot of younger people being infected. They think they're fine. What happens if this goes on board and then becomes a chronic issue
Yeah.
and then shows up years later? That's going to be an interesting scenario. We're hoping that's not the case, but we need to study it this way as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real key factor, but it in many ways these go together with what we've been doing with Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, where infectious components have now come onto the scene to be very important, either as triggering agents leading to the disease process
Sure.
and or as exacerbating agents. And we're also talking here about polymicrobial issues. This
Yep.
is not a one size fits all, which is also an important concept here, is
Yeah.
that many of these agents may be working in concert
Mm-hmm.
um, with one another to actually create this problem in the nervous system.
That makes a great deal of sense. It's like this newer concept that's emerging in the publications of the pathobiome or the pathobiota, the organisms, unhelpful passengers that we may have that could present, a situation that could set you up for a state like a neurodegenerative state, for example.
Yes, in fact, some recent studies are showing that the microbiota in our gut,
Mm-hmm.
some of those bacteria, some of those organisms can actually trigger immune responses in our bodies that are more systemic. Some of those responses, actually, in studying multiple sclerosis, for instance, have been showing that the generation of an immune response by these gut microbiota may actually be worsening multiple sclerosis
Sure.
due to this immune response. And so the crossover immunity of now attacking the myelin sheath, the myelin basic proteins, et cetera, in the axons of our central nervous system, leading to an exacerbation of multiple sclerosis.
Wow.
So another disease entity here in which infectious agents may actually now be affecting how it manifests.
And that's fascinating. And that goes along with a paper that came out of Harvard a few years ago, which examined the microbiome of patients with MS and identified an unhelpful mix of organisms in the guts of patients with MS, like such as Acinetobacter and resistant E. coli. They identified more what quote bad microorganisms in patients with MS in their gut microbiota. So it's fascinating. So do you feel, Brian, that the lessons we are learning presently with COVID can help? It can really essentially help us. Like obviously, the global pandemic has been incredibly horrendous, but do you think that there are research lessons that can be sort of pulled from this experience with COVID and everything that's been done to quickly research this new pathogen that could potentially be applied to our understanding of chronic diseases like Alzheimer's, which have also been associated to infections?
Yes, I actually do. I think that if we just consider what's happening here in an acute sense, even if it's just through the sense of smell changes and the olfactory insult, this is not a new concept. The olfactory insults with infectious agents have been known for decades. What has not been accepted, though, is that those olfactory insults and olfactory damage, ingress into the brain through this process by infectious agents, can actually cause many different types of diseases because you now have infectious agents getting into the brain, bypassing the blood-brain barrier, now being insulting nerves, the glial cells, the microglia, the astroglia, how they're responding as an internal immune system, the pericytes that are monitoring what's happening around blood vessels and happening what's going on in the brain, oligodendrocytes, how they're going to be activated, deactivated to produce myelin. So these agents going in this way are particularly damaging and particularly harmful. We have not accepted this as being a key route to the outcome of neurodegenerative disease. And this is where we need to start focusing even more so that this particular route, once you're in the brain and the connectivity of nerve cells from one to the other, going to very key areas in our nervous system, this is something of great importance. And we have to now stop thinking that this is secondary or as not as important as blood-brain barrier damage or changes in this disease, but they have to be looked in concert here of how this could really now potentiate nervous system change long term. So the COVID-2 virus, in studying this and studying this disease, um, we need to consider how this is now a model actually
Sure.
for what many of us have seen and how this is actually happening in the nervous system.
Well, that's really helpful. And, it's definitely, as you pointed out, it's sort of taking a spotlight, right, and shining it in the direction of, okay, well, so what other pathogens, as you pointed out, have the ability to gain access, right, either through the blood-brain barrier in infected cells like monocytes or directly through the olfactory passageway, and then which organisms are capable of eliciting this sort of really robust cytokine response, right? Or to
Right.
create a state of immune dysfunction where, essentially there's inflammation and damage. So I'm just so grateful for the time that you took to talk through all of this today and for the work that you're doing. And so thank you so much for joining me today for the call. It was wonderful. And keep doing the wonderful work that you're doing, Brian.
Well, it's my pleasure speaking with you, Nikki, too, and we're going to continue the work. We've been in a bit of a slowdown because of the pandemic, and at the medical school, we had to shut down our research for some time. It's now coming back on board slowly, but we are committed to seeing this through, of to continue to understand how infectious agents really are involved with these processes. So we're tackling it head on, and hopefully through a lot of collaboration. My collaborators, Alan Hudson, who was in this process from the beginning with me,
Sure.
and my collaborators here with Dr. Appelt and Little and Hingley and Hammond, and then we have other collaborations across the globe. So I think that through this and through interacting with other people, looking at other infectious agents as well, we as a group can start to make these inroads, important inroads, to try to change the course of events here. Uh,
Right.
and whether that we're changing that through using anti-infectives or developing vaccines, um, I'm hoping we'll be able to now impact as many people that get neurodegenerative diseases across the globe, which is huge.
Yeah, it's a huge goal, and it's amazing and wonderful, to have brave scientists like yourself, like all of those that, have taken the time and, thoughtfulness essentially to pursue other avenues to give us more puzzle pieces to put together, right? Because
Yes.
at the end of the day, learning that something isn't important is equally as impactful as learning that it is. So it seems, like you've made tremendous headway, and hopefully what happens from here on out is there will be a better understanding going forward as a result of the pandemic, and perhaps enhanced funding for more work like the work that your lab does.
Yeah,
So,
and that's what we're seeing is that um, you can't have enough funding
yeah,
for this whole arena
yeah,
and the different work that's being done in this arena, uh, as is seen now with vaccine development for COVID-2.
sure.
Um, or against COVID-2. So it comes down to that. Yes, we need to put money behind these types of efforts. We need to also believe in the science and to look at the science and recognize this type of reality and start using our understanding to make the difference.
And that makes sense. And so, just again, can't thank you enough. And I guess we'll conclude here. And at some point, we'll have to have you back to keep discussing, as the research progresses, and to speak again. Thanks so much,
Okay,
Ryan.
it'll be a pleasure to come back too. Thank you for having me today too.
Have a
Okay,
great day.
all right, bye bye.
Bye.